Hello, everyone. We'll be starting in just a couple of minutes. Well, it is a little bit after 4:30, and we are going to go ahead and get started. Greetings to you all, and thank you for being with us. Welcome to our Black History Month celebration, sponsored by the Perro Multicultural Center here at the Lutheran School of Theology at Chicago. My name is Denise Rector, and I will be the moderator for today's discussion. Our discussion today is titled, "The Impact of Mass Incarceration on the Black Family." The impact of mass incarceration on the Black family. The theme for our Black History Month celebration is Black Family Wellness. The Black family has many working parts with many different aspects. And as we continue to battle injustice and pursue racial equity, the growth of America's penal system and its impact on the Black community has moved to the forefront of the struggle. According to criminal justice advocate and author Michelle Alexander, quote, "Mass incarceration is a massive system of racial and social control, where people who have been convicted of crimes are then released into a permanent second-class status in which they are stripped of basic civil and human rights," unquote. Not only does this systemic injustice impact the formerly incarcerated, but it also impacts the entire family. So as we highlight Black family wellness, we must explore how mass incarceration impacts the Black family. Before we get into our discussion, let me introduce our speaker for today. And that is Jia Johnson, who is Director of the Solidarity Building Initiative at McCormick Theological Seminary. Jia Johnson is a community healer at the intersection of creative education, liberative praxis, community building, spiritual writing, and abolition. Her commitments to dismantling oppressive systems and imaging into existence new systems of flourishing are influenced by her lived experience, community of belonging, and progressive faith beliefs. Johnson designed and established the Solidarity Building Initiative for Liberative Carceral Education. I want to say that again. The Solidarity Building Initiative for Liberative Carceral Education at McCormick Theological Seminary. And she currently serves as its director. As the director, she serves as creative educator, liberative practitioner, and community builder, co-creating learning communities, programs, curricula, and collaborations that tend to the whole of incarcerated learners at the Cook County Jail and also to their communities of belonging. Again, my name is Denise Rector. I'm a PhD student here at the Lutheran School of Theology at Chicago. And let's take a moment to welcome our guest speakers and our viewing audience. Before we get into the discussion, let's take a look at the data and the statistics related to the mass incarceration of people of color. And we have a slide put together by Marvis Hardy, who has done a lot of the backbone work for this presentation and in getting our speakers. So very happy for that. And we're going to walk through the slides now to get some background on the topic. So moving to slide 2, public policy changes since 1970. So that is within the lifetime of some of us, have increased the U.S. prison population from 200,000, that 1970 number, to 6.8 million in 2020. Slide 3, please. The United States comprises 5% of the global population, yet has nearly 25% of the world's prison population. White Americans comprise over a little over 60% of the US population, and Black Americans comprise about 13.4% of the US population. Yet African Americans alone constituted 2.3 million, 34% of the total 6.8 million people in correctional facilities. African Americans are incarcerated at more than 5 times the rate of whites. African Americans are incarcerated more than 5 times the rate of whites. Next slide, please. Thank you. African American children represent 14% of the United States population, yet African American children represent 32% of all children arrested, 42% of all children detained by police, and 52% of all children whose cases are judicially waived to criminal court. Since 1991, the rate of violent crime in the United States has fallen by about 20%, while the number of people in prison and jail has risen by 50%. And for people of color, that number is even higher. Minorities are more likely to be incarcerated for criminal offending compared to their white counterparts residing in more affluent communities. Incarceration negatively affects individuals during their prison stay and long after they have served their sentence. Incarceration also affects their children, their families, social networks, and the communities in which they live. Next slide, please. Those who are incarcerated disproportionately experience certain health problems, including infectious diseases, including HIV and AIDS, hepatitis B and C, and tuberculosis. They experience certain chronic diseases like asthma, diabetes, and hypertension, and also suffer from mental illness. Next slide, please. In 34 states, people who are on parole or probation cannot vote. In 12 states, a felony conviction means never voting again. Next slide, please. Many individuals violate the terms of their parole and are returned to prison for a technical violation. Technical violations occur when a parolee fails to follow rules established as part of their parole terms, such as keeping appointments with a parole officer, failing to pay their court fees and penalties, failing to pay restitution, or failing to abide by a curfew. Next slide, please. Clearly, we are living in an era of mass imprisonment that has transformed a generation of young Black men into a permanently disadvantaged population, deprived of civil rights and human dignity. Today, the prison system is important not solely for its effects on crime, but for its effects on the social and economic inequality of Black and brown families. 5 million children have at least one parent incarcerated in the United States. Approximately 70% of prisoners are fathers. 44% of state prisoners live with their children at the time of incarceration. And 62% of imprisoned fathers report at least monthly contact with their children while incarcerated, either by phone, mail, or visits. Prisons remove men from their families. Incarceration assigns stigma not just to those formerly incarcerated, but to their families as well. Incarceration also draws the entire family into the law enforcement process of official supervision. Parental incarceration also traumatizes young adults as they increasingly experience anxiety disorder, felony offense charges, spend more time in jail, they fail to complete high school, become parents at an age younger than age 18, and they endure social stigma and isolation. Meanwhile, the prison system in America is a multi-billion-dollar industry. The mass incarceration of Black and Brown people is not costing America money. The industry is making money, and once again, America is being built on the backs of Black and Brown peoples. We will end the slideshow here, and we will begin our discussion here. I invite audience members to please put their questions in the chat, and we will work to answer as many of them as possible after the presentations have been completed. So please, as you're listening, as questions come in, feel free to put them in the chat while we have our conversation. And at this point, I would like to invite into the conversation our guest, Jia Johnson. Jia, good evening to you. Thank you so much for being with us this evening.
Good evening to you, Denise. Thank you so much for laying just some foundation for us to kind of begin this conversation. And I'm grateful for the opportunity to be here. Thank you, Marvis, for the invitation and for everyone that has put this presentation on and hosted this event. So I'm going to do a little bit of screen sharing, so bear with me. So I'm also going to be reading. So I want to apologize in advance if I'm looking down and not at the camera. But last year, I spoke to a group of undergraduate students in a public ministry degree program, and they were located in Minnesota. And I was there to talk about my works of public justice, much like I am doing here with you all. The work that I do is with and for those individuals who are detained at the Cook County Department of Corrections. And one of the students asked me, when was the first time I had ever visited a jail? It was actually the first time anyone has ever asked me that question. And so I actually had to think for a short second. And then I instantly remembered that my first time was back in 2013, 2014. And as a family, we drove about 30 minutes to the El Paso County Jail to visit our loved one. He had spent about 1.5 years in the county jail on false charges. At the time, I had recently started my own faith journey, and I was an adult in my early 30s, and neither me nor my loved one grew up in the church. But I often say that it was God that heard the cries of a mother praying, fasting, and wrestling with God to save her children. Me and my loved one had both experienced substantial trauma over the years, I as a young adult and he as an adolescent. And neither one of us really had the tools to support ourselves through the healing process of those traumatic events. And so we both use various vices to address the impact of underlying trauma. And at a very young age, my loved one was exposed to street drugs by an adult who was an educator, and who was entrusted with nurturing and developing his youthfulness. And so since a young age, my loved one struggled to overcome substance dependency. And during his time of pretrial detention, Jesus met him in his darkest hour. He was reading the Bible, he was praying, he was reflecting, he was confessing, repenting, and lamenting. And he was also being discipled by a man who was his cellmate. And he spoke to us with such joy about the Bible studies that they were co-leading and hosting together. And so while locked in this carceral cage, he experienced salvation. Or as the father of Black liberation theology, James Cones, would say, he experienced liberation. That liberation that comes from the Spirit of God interacting with the image of God in one's own humanity. God moved in and through the church, the ecclesia, behind jail walls. And God mothered and nurtured and cared for their church community and their achy and weary spirits. I'm also aware that in a semblance of a therapeutic or rehabilitative environment in a carceral space is oftentimes the result of incarcerated people making beauty in the midst of the ugliness. And make no mistake, God is already there in it with them. And so God met them and my loved one at the foot of the modern day cross, the carceral system. As many liberation scholars would say, there is a double meaning to the cross. It is both a symbol of state-sanctioned violence and the depths to which God will travel to love humanity into the wholeness of beloved community. Lee Griffin, in The Fall of the Prisons, Biblical Perspectives on Prison Abolition, proclaims, whenever we cage people, we are in reality fueling and participating in the same spirit we claim to renounce. In the biblical understanding, the spirit of the prison is the spirit of death. But there is also the Spirit of God breathing life into those dead places through people. Wherever the Spirit of God is moving and stirring and gathering people to create beloved community, there is the church and there is God. But this spirit of death that Griffin speaks about extends beyond the carceral walls. And in 2014, the charges were dropped and he was released. Over the course of those years, I watched the trap of re-entry barriers, stigmas, and untreated mental health suffocate his vision and hope for a new beginning. Over the course of 4 years, I watched my loved one hustle and struggle to actualize his very own slice of the so-called American dream with business ownership. And with every decision made, he moved a little closer to his dreams. But moving towards his dreams came with a cost, a compromise today so that he could get to where he wanted to be tomorrow, which was to be self-sufficient, to thrive, to flourish, to provide for him and his 2 daughters, much like I'm sure every one of you here has desires for. And 2 years ago, while hanging on by a string, he finally made it. He hustled and struggled and fed and nurtured his entrepreneur spirit and opened that business. And then COVID-19 arrived and decimated this hope, this vision, and this plan. COVID-19 was merciless to him, along with the 41% of Black businesses that have been disproportionately impacted by COVID-19 in comparison to their white counterparts. So while my family has not literally, at least at that time, been infected by the virus, we have felt the impact of its destruction. And yet through it all, it was God and his loved ones who provided financial, emotional, and spiritual support. The family that supports him has struggled with him. We have carried his burdens and our own burdens. We have felt the utter helplessness of navigating a system that was never intended to support him or his family. I have sat with him on the phone while sitting in the parking lot of the treatment facility, only for him to be turned away when he arrived to the front desk. I have heard the pain in the mother's voice when she calls to tell me that the treatment facility has let him out again, only after 3 days. I've heard the hope in my niece's voice, only to be disappointed again. We have had to make decisions that no loved one should ever have to make, negotiating between whose life we are going to protect today. We have made 911 calls, begging police officers to please not shoot or detain, but to please transfer him to a treatment facility. I've often said that something dies inside of you when you come to the realization that the safest place for a loved one struggling with mental health and substance dependency is incarceration, because affordable long-term treatment facilities are far and few between, and quite frankly, only designated for those on the right side of the wealth gap. Today, my loved one is one of the 40% of people that has recidivated within the 3rd year of release, and one of the 1.2 million individuals who have been criminalized for their mental health. When Daniel Prude, the man in Rochester, New York, whose family called the police because he was experiencing a mental health crisis, and the police arrived and Daniel Prude died, I can't also escape thinking of my own family dynamic and the millions of families that share this experience with us. The family that loves him is part of the 6.5 million adults who have an immediate family member currently incarcerated in a jail or prison. 6 out of 10 African Americans and Native Americans have an immediate family member who has been to jail or prison. Black people are 50% more likely than white people to have a family member who is formerly or currently incarcerated, and 3 times more likely to have a family member who has spent at least 10 years in prison. I share this story because we have to start telling our stories. We have to come out from hiding and speak our truth so that we can find healing and solidarity with each other on this journey to finding solutions to the problems that we have inherited from a country founded on what Bell Hooks calls white supremacy, capitalistic patriarchy. Speaking our truth begins to erode the internalized stigmas that keep us silent about our suffering, about the sufferings caused by mass incarceration. The suffering we are experiencing is not only individual, but it is collective. 1 in 4 Black children have a parent who is incarcerated. While Black men make up 6% of the population, they make up 40% of the prison population. For African American men who are under 35 and have dropped out of high school, their chances that they will serve some time in prison is approximately 37%. African American women and Latina women are the fastest growing segment of the American prison population, and most of them are single mothers. Incarceration destabilizes social networks, it disconnects families from emotional and financial support, and negatively impacts economic and political infrastructures. There are 5.8 million people who have lost their right to vote due to incarceration. When we consider the Black and brown people who make up the vast majority of the prison population, we have to also ask ourselves, where are all of our entrepreneurs, our business-minded community members that create economic markets in our community? Well, my experience with my own loved one and my experience over the past several years of working both in a re-entry entrepreneurship program and behind the walls of Cook County Department of Corrections, I can say that they are incarcerated. Our entrepreneurs are incarcerated. Our so-called correctional system better prepares people to return to prison than it does to prepare people to live successfully outside of incarceration. When Cain killed Abel, what was God's response? God did not unleash vengeance, retribution, retaliation, violence, or wrath. God gave Cain a mark of protection and one of accountability. When harms have been committed, we as the church, we as people of faith, we as just good citizens of this country, of this world, I believe that we are called to do also as God did with Cain, which is to both protect and to hold our communities accountable, including those who harm and those who have been harmed. And so while I am the director of the Solidarity Building Initiative for Liberative Carceral Education, I am first the sister to a loved one who is incarcerated. I am the daughter of a mother and a father who want to see their child live. I'm the auntie of 2 beautiful nieces who want their parent to receive the treatment they need. I'm a comrade, a community healer, a community member seeking and working to find solutions and resources, and to create programs and relationships that have the power to transform our lives, our families, and our communities. And lastly, I'm a co-laborer with you and with God in making justice in this very messy place that we call life. Again, it is an honor to be here, and I'm really grateful for this opportunity to engage in this conversation with you. So as I've already noted in my introduction, some of the impact around incarceration on the Black family and Black communities, I'm going to spend the remainder of my time sharing a little bit more about some of the theories and theologies and frameworks that are really undergirding the work that I'm doing at SBI, as well as I'm going to share some of the historical, political, and social realities that are undergirding incarceration. And then I'm going to spend a little bit of time kind of unpacking and kind of going through the mission and vision of the work that I do. So the Solidarity Building Initiative really is a re-entry abolition project. It is rooted and propelled in and by the spirit of solidarity. And part of how we demonstrate that is by utilizing our resources and the privileges that we have to really work at cultivating justice and to do it with and for those folks who are marginalized by our criminal punishment system. So I think that there's a lot of different definitions about what abolition means, but abolition is not just about the dismantling of systems, but it's also about the creation of new ones. And so as an abolition project, we seek to be creators, builders, gardeners of the vital systems of nourishment, support, and healing that many of our communities desperately need. And liberative carceral education is the garden, really, that we do our work of solidarity and justice making. And so as a re-entry model, we believe that re-entry starts the moment that somebody is detained by the police. Re-entry does not start when someone leaves incarceration. And within our model, students are centered, and it is influenced by restorative justice, healing education, and these abolition practices. So abolition, what is it? I'm going to share a definition that is really kind of widely accepted. It is defined as a loose network of groups and activists that seek to reduce or eliminate prisons and the prison system, and to replace them with systems of rehabilitation that do not focus on punishment. Again, systems that do not focus on punishment or on government institutionalization. Prison abolition, according to Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who has been in this work for decades, states that abolition is a long-term goal and practical policy program, calling for government investments in jobs, education, housing, and healthcare, all of the elements that are required for a productive and violence-free life. Abolition means not just the closing of prisons, but the presence instead of vital systems of support that so many of our communities lack, so many Black and Brown communities lack. And so instead of asking how in a future without prisons we will deal with so-called violent people, abolitionists ask how we resolve inequalities and get people the resources they need long before the hypothetical moment when, as Gilmore puts it, they mess up. Abolition is about asking how we got here, not what is wrong with that particular person. And the questions that we ask are going to drive the solutions that we seek. In a recent lecture entitled "Let's Get Free: A Case for Abolition Theology," Darnell Moore said this about abolition. Abolition is a form of analysis and an organizing practice that is not centered only on the removal of the systems that harm us, but the process of imagining into being the life, soul affirming tools that ought to go in the place of the things that harm us. According to Wilson, abolition is figuring out how to work with people, to make something rather than figuring out how to erase something. Abolition is ultimately a politics and praxis of creation, not just destruction. It demands that we broaden and diversify our imagination to activate, complicate, stretch what Robin D.G. Kelly calls our freedom dreams. And so when I speak of abolition, I invite you to cultivate your own creative capacities with me and imagine that the work of abolition is about creating in such a way that our current harmful, exploitive, and subjugating systems, practices, and tools become outdated and extinct. Using a little bit of theological language, abolition is resurrection. It is an ushering in of a new social order, one that moves us closer towards a world where social and individual sins and systemic oppression do not have the last word, but where individual and social flourishing reign. So lastly, for us at the Solidarity Building Initiative, Jesus demonstrates and models for us a pattern of living our life with and for those who have been pushed to the margins of society. He came to set the captives free. And so Jesus demonstrated this rugged and gritty solidarity, a solidarity that unapologetically sides with those who are poor and oppressed by these systemic oppressions. One that does not see poverty as a virtue, but poverty as a result of unjust relationships between human beings. And so the work that we are doing at McCormick it really demands that we hear and we listen to the cries of those who have been oppressed, and then we join them in efforts to liberate them. And so how do we begin this work? Where does it start? And so I'm going to say that as a religious academic institution, it has to start with our history. So Kaya Stern, I'm not going to dive too much into this, but I am actually going to I highly recommend this text, Voices from American Prisons. Kaya is actually a good friend of mine. I consider her a mentor. And there's a chapter that she wrote in her book where she chronicles really the relationship of religious education in the construction of the penitentiary. It is a powerful text. It is a life-changing chapter. I highly recommend it. So I'm just going to kind of share with you a little bit of what I've learned from reading this book. But Kaya Stern in this text states that during the birth of the penitentiary, which was during 1770 to 1820s, it was common belief that criminality was the result of personal evils and dishonest companions, having very little to do with the social, economic, and political evils. And so very much like today, right? Our issues are oftentimes rooted in the individual rather than the social and systemic conditions of oppression. And so during this time, while Indigenous people were experiencing genocide and forced removal from their land, and Black people were enslaved in chattel slavery and policed by fugitive slave laws, the penitentiary was primarily an institution that was created to rehabilitate white law-breaking men to become more law-abiding citizens. In 1819, the Auburn State Prison in New York became the leading model for prison construction. It was referred to as the congregant style model, which combined Bible study with industrious toil. And the idea was that these two methods would produce the desired effects of reforming the person. So those incarcerated at Auburn State Prison were subjected to a range of abuse, violence, and exploited practices of punishment through the use of religious education, forced silence, isolation, prison labor, and convict leasing. Stern rightly asserts that the Auburn model deformed rather than reformed the individual. And tragically, this malformation was deeply influenced by the Christian tradition. Lins was the first warden of Auburn and later at Sing Sing. He was a Calvinist, and he believed that all convicts were cowards who could not be reformed until their spirit was broken. Lins, also known as one of the most influential architects of the early development of the prison system, it was under his leadership that prison practices became increasingly more degrading, punitive, and violent. The Auburn State Prison under Lins' leadership ushered in the exploitation of prison labor as part of the character of the prison, which really set the stage for the penitentiary to become the new plantation, replacing the newly abolished system of chattel slavery. So while the violent, abusive, and exploitive nature of the penitentiary cannot be denied, history also reveals that the transformative effects of prison education, and in particular religious education, did have some sort of impact on incarcerated learners. Megan Sweeney, in a text called Reading is My Window, Books and the Arts of Reading in Women's Prison, shares the following remarks, offered by a warden shortly after the Civil War. Young men who were 2 years ago first taught lessons here are now good readers, and it seems as if they have changed entirely in body and mind. He goes on to say that ignorance makes many convicts, education alone makes the man. So yes, the warden's words are incredibly dehumanizing, and his ideologies towards incarcerated people are very harmful. But the access to spiritual readings and education did have a transformative impact on the lives of those who were incarcerated. This is all true today. I'm assuming that this is an audience full of seminarians and educators, and so we all recognize the power of education and how it changes our mindsets, our worldviews, and it also increases our access to social networks. And so education is transformative regardless of our social location or our social identity. But it also cannot be overlooked that the warden's comments came on the heels of the abolition of chattel slavery, and that who he was primarily referencing were white incarcerated men. Black folks were primarily held captive in the economic system of chattel slavery, which by its very nature breeds the practice of punishment, violence, and illiteracy as a means to exploit Black labor. It was the abolition of chattel slavery that began the shift of the penitentiary began the shift of the population of the penitentiary, the demographic. And so while chattel slavery was abolished, the spirit that gave it life, a race-based capitalistic political economy of white supremacy, took a new life in the form of convict leasing, shifting penitentiary demographics from white men to newly freed Black people. And so rather than being privately owned by slaveholders, the newly freed Black folks became the property of the state, white-ruled state. And for violating Black codes and vagrancy laws instituted by the states, they were incarcerated. And so under this new system of slavery, the 13th Amendment made it constitutionally permissible for Southern states to literally lease Black bodies to former slaveholders, replacing slave labor with convict labor. In doing so, convict leasing In doing so, convict leasing protected and sustained the capital investment of white billionaires and the largest single financial asset in the entire US economy, Black labor that was worth $3.4 billion. So just as in the era of chattel slavery, illiteracy and education were tools to keep Black folks, Black convicts at that time, now part of the penitentiary, as good, ignorant laborers, Sweeney writes this. Economic incentives completely trumped efforts to educate prisoners. Because African Americans were considered purely animal and incapable of learning, it was deemed wasteful to provide prisoners with opportunities for education and rehabilitation. The record of the late 19th century penal practices suggests that African American convicts were considered nothing, totally dispensable, and were therefore given nothing to read. The de jure prohibition of reading by African Americans in the antebellum South was thus succeeded by the penal system's de facto prohibition of reading by thousands of African Americans who were shunted from slavery into convict leasing. Our history reveals that the penitentiary replaced the plantation as the primary gatekeeper for white ruling class, ensuring that the theft of Black labor and that education was only a human right for those whom the white ruling class deemed human, white men in particular, and white people in general. It cannot be forgotten that Christianity and the religious education played a fundamental role in shaping prison culture and practices into what it is today. And in the words of Kaya Stern, a spirit of punishment is what undergirds our carceral system. And in many ways, it is we live in a culture and a spirit of punishment. So with this history in mind, prior to the work that I did prior to coming to McCormick, I came across a set of startling statistics, which have been some of the driving force of my commitments to this work around prison abolition, but they've also have helped me really be intentional in thinking about how we do this work at the Solidarity Building Initiative. And so what most people don't know is that 95% of the prison population will be released, with most of them returning to the same disinvested zip codes that created conditions ripe for hyper-incarceration. A lack of quality education, a lack of reliable transportation, lucrative job opportunities, healthcare, mental health services. Moreover, there are over 40,000 collateral consequences or re-entry barriers that prohibit folks who have the experience of incarceration from successfully navigating in society. Nearly half of those restrictions are related to employment. And so upon release, those who have been deemed the criminal class are transferred from the physical cage of incarceration to the cage of social bondage or re-entry barriers. One of my colleagues, Marlon Chamberlain, he is the campaign manager for the Fully Free campaign, which is a campaign to end permanent punishments or re-entry barriers. And in a report that they did, they said that here in the state of Illinois, there are 28 sanctions that govern education. There are at least 365 state laws and regulations that restrict occupational licensing for people with a criminal record. Up until recently, somebody who had a criminal record could not get a license to be a barber. One of the key barriers to education noted by people with records is just not having sufficient financial support to pursue education. According to the prisonpolicy.org, formerly incarcerated population makes up 5 million people, and they also make up the most active job-seeking population. So in spite of negative stereotypes that want to portray incarcerated folks as lazy and only interested in criminality, the data shows that they are the most active job-seeking population. However, their unemployment rate is 27% in comparison to the 5.2% of unemployment for the general public. They go on to report that for formerly incarcerated people looking for jobs, it is worse than that of the Great Depression. Without stable employment and livable wages, people who are impacted by our criminal punishment system become incredibly vulnerable to homelessness. One study indicated that 79% of formerly incarcerated individuals could not secure stable housing. Without the necessary and vital resources, as Gilmore has told us about abolition, the odds of recidivism or returning back to incarceration increase, most often due to survival crimes. Even more troubling is the reality that prisons and jails offer limited educational programs and resources that are necessary and critical in preparing incarcerated persons to flourish upon release. Again, prisons do more to prepare people to return to incarceration than they actually do to be able to successfully reintegrate. I'm going to share this. This is fairly old data, and some policy has changed in the last several years. But the 1998 Clinton crime bill did away with Pell Grants, which meant that folks who were incarcerated could no longer access Pell Grants for higher education. And so with that also wiped out a lot of the programs that were available in carceral spaces. But I do think that this is important. This data is still important because while they have been reinstated, Pell Grants have been reinstated, the need is still great. So in 2016, the Vera Institute of Justice reported that only 35% of state prisons provided college-level courses. And these programs only serves 6% of the incarcerated individuals nationwide. So I did the math to kind of put this in perspective. There are nearly 2,000 state correctional facilities that incarcerate approximately 1 million people, which means that 700 facilities offer college-level courses to approximately 120 incarcerated people. 1 million people who are incarcerated, 700 facilities, and only 120 people get access to higher ed in prison programs. Moreover, the true cost of incarceration on families surveyed a little over 1,000 people who are formerly incarcerated. 67% said that they wanted to return to school. Only 27 were able to. 3 in 5 were unable to afford school, and 1 in 4 were denied or barred from educational loans. And again, due to recent policy with the reinstatement of Pell Grants, they have also increased access to financial aid for folks who have have some sort of criminal conviction. But there are some conditions around that, which I don't recall offhand. But I think the point is that the social exclusion from a post-incarcerational education opportunities is mirrored by the lack of prison education programs. So a good friend of mine, Reverend Dr. Nakia Smith Robert, she's the founder of an organization called Abolition Sanctuary. She recently gave a presentation, and I thought that this was a very powerful quote. I think for many of us, how we choose to invest, whether it's an individual, a household, a city government, state government, federal government, how we choose to invest our dollars says a lot about who and what we care about. And so in California, a glance at the budgetary spending reveals societal and institutional values, she says. It costs on average approximately $106,000 per year to incarcerate a person in California prisons, which is more than the tuition cost to attend Harvard. $106,000 per year to incarcerate someone in a California prison is more than the tuition cost to attend an Ivy League university. We spend more to incarcerate than we do to educate. And we do this even knowing that education has the power to change lives. For every dollar invested in a prison education program, it reduces the cost of recidivism by $4 to $5. And I want to be clear that we are not, when we make these investments, we are investing in people. We're investing in their future. We're investing in their community. We are investing in their family. We are saying that we are committed to seeing them successfully reintegrate back into community. Research found that individuals who participated in correctional programs have 43% lower odds of returning to prison than those who do not. It also increases the odds of employment by 13%. So we know that the data tells us that higher ed in prison works. Something else to note is that the recent study by Georgetown University stated that 65% of all jobs in the economy will require some sort of post-secondary education or training beyond high school. And yet we release people from incarceration, Black and brown people from incarceration, without giving them the vital skills and networks and resources to be able to successfully enter into the marketplace. We also know that higher education provides and helps to cultivate, just education in general, some of the most important human skills that employers will be looking for in 2020. We have already arrived. Critical thinking, analysis, complex problem solving, leadership, social influence, emotional intelligence, active learning, and learning strategies. So what does this mean? Right? I want to tie this back to the work that I'm also doing. So as I started to wrestle with this data, with these statistics, I had to begin to think about what does this mean for the work that I'm doing at McCormick, and what does it mean for us as an institution? How might seminaries such as McCormick, and so I started to wrestle with these questions. How might seminaries such as McCormick Theological Seminary, who are in the service of liberative theologies and practices, become co-laborers in the movement to abolish the carceral state? What would it look like for seminaries like McCormick to create programs of liberative theological education that intentionally mitigate the collateral consequences, the social, material, and political barriers that justice impacted people experience? What would it mean for a seminary to deploy their institutional resources and networks beyond the academic institution and directly serve marginalized communities? And so these questions, along with the history and along with the social realities, it kind of really sheds light on this question that a student asked me. He actually didn't ask me just this question, but he unapologetically asked this to a group of academics who were at the Cook County Jail right before COVID-19 hit. McCormick is one of many academic institutions who are providing educational resources. And he asked the question, what is your end goal for doing this work? Is your end goal to make a model inmate? Sounds very reminiscent of the ways in which religious education was used to mold or deform, dehumanize people who are incarcerated, to make them into the image that we think that they ought to be made in. And he goes on to say that because for me, I'm fighting for my freedom. The many courses that I have taken while incarcerated have transformed me. I am legit no longer the person that I once was before incarceration. Elsewhere, he told me that had he had access to some of these educational resources long before, he may have made different choices. We've had students in our courses who have talked to us about in the 4 years of incarceration, a pretrial incarceration, they had access to a better education than they did in the 4 years of high school. That's a systemic issue. We have in our classroom, legitimately, we have men who are incarcerated with their children. It is an intergenerational problem that we have. And so what does this mean for us? How do we do this work? And so liberative carceral education it's really a framework that I put together to help really guide the work that we're doing at McCormick, so that our praxis hold us accountable to our vision and to our mission. And so there's two aspects to this. It's liberative carceral education, institutional leadership, and classroom culture and pedagogy. I won't go into great detail, but really at the core of it, liberative education is directed at promoting healing and liberation that is both individual and it is social. It's really drawing on a lot of the works of Bell Hooks in Teaching to Transgress, where she talks about theory is not inherently healing, liberatory, or revolutionary. It fulfills this function when we ask that it do so and direct our theorizing towards this end. Education isn't about just having a bunch of right knowledge or right words or right language, but how does it legitimately change and transform not only ourselves, but then we go out into the world and we are transformative in the world. And so as an institution, part of how we're living into this is that liberative carceral education, it's holistic, and it's holistic liberation and transformation. And so it really centers the social, material, and political needs of the students both inside and outside the classroom. We take seriously our history. Because if we don't take seriously our history, we will run the risk of bolstering a history that we don't really want to, that we will end up bolstering a history that has caused so much oppression and so much harm. And we will actually be running in the opposite direction of the mission that we hold. As a connector, we recognize that we aren't the savior in the community, right? We are working alongside folks. We are a part of a movement that is larger than us. It is beyond us. And we are a part of that movement. And we work alongside community-based organizations, other seminaries, grassroots organizations, all towards this collective vision of liberation. We don't hoard our resources. We do resource sharing. And we deploy those resources and those networks beyond the academic institution and directly serve marginalized communities. In the classroom, and in particular in the classroom, we're talking about being in this death-dealing, dehumanizing, punishment-based, isolating, disconnected place. The work that we do must be inclusive. Let me turn off my headset, it's disconnected. All right, here we go. So the work that we do must be inclusive. And so part of that is creating a culture where students' lived experience is an authoritative source of knowledge. It's in dialogue with educators and the authors with which we are working with, and that lived experience also is creating an environment that is democratic, where students feel a sense of ownership and responsibility to contribute and to participate. I will say this, which kind of leads to the student-centered piece, is that our students, their agency, their voice, the things that they need, and really shape the programs that we offer. And so they are co-creators with us in this work. And I think the other piece is that liberative carceral education, it disrupts hierarchy. We don't tokenize. And representation matters. And it is so vitally important that when we're in this carceral space, that our students, Black and brown students, can see directly formerly incarcerated people who are in the community as educators and community leaders and community organizers. They get to see themselves, and it gives them a sense of hope. And this has been the response that we've gotten from all of our students. It's a mutual place of transformation, the carceral classroom. So as people of faith coming into a carceral space, we aren't bringing Jesus. This is not what we are doing. We are meeting God where God is already at. We are not the only ones bringing knowledge, but we are mutually on journey to transformation, and our students have something to share, and we have something to learn from our students just as much as they have something to learn from us. Our students are invited to construct meaning by integrating what they're learning and how it sits within and how it speaks to them in their current cultural context. The component of reflection and action that we are learning and we are doing, and the component of community building, and all of these attributes, characteristics, this framework is really helping us to create a flourishing community for both as an institution and both in the carceral classroom. So I'm gonna finish up here with, just now that I've kind of shared some of that background. We are a higher ed in prison program, higher ed in jail program, and our mission is social driven. The initiative seeks to mitigate the numerous material, social, and political barriers that system impacted individuals experience both while incarcerated and upon release. We envision that seminary ed and jail will not only provide resources for intellectual and spiritual growth and flourishing, but that we really are working to create communities of belonging and advocacy. So it is both individual and it is both systemic. We see justice as being in right relationship with ourselves, with God, with others, including our relationships to institutions and systems. And for us, we want to create a program, a space, an environment where folks can flourish because they've been connected to the resources that they need. And so we do this through 4 programs: the seminary ed and jail. We have a 2-part certificate, but we also do a host of other things, educational programs inside of the jail. I get to work with my colleague Marlon Chamberlain, who is the campaign manager for the Fully Free system, and together we co-created a reentry support system. And this reentry support system works with SBI alum. An SBI alum is someone who has gone through the program while incarcerated, and upon release, we reconnect with them, and we pair them with a coach. And this coach and our SBI alum, they create a care support system. And this care support system is really based on the needs that the SBI alum has expressed. And we do some resource sharing. We do some network building, social capital. And then we have collaborative partnerships. And this is where we work with folks like Equity and Transformation, the Fully Free campaign, folks over at Dominican and Garrett. And because we recognize that this work needs to be done as a collective, and we imagine together different ways that we can do this. Public ed and advocacy, which really is what I'm doing right now, focuses on initiatives and educational efforts that increase awareness and advocacy on these issues of mass incarceration. So to date, COVID-19 has also kind of impacted our access to our students. And so we haven't done too much in person. We've done mostly virtual, but we have served 66 students to date. And we have 4 alum and 2 of which we are currently working with. And I want to shout out that one of them started school just a few days ago. And another one is working on getting some licensure to be a truck driver. And I'm not going to go into detail on this reentry support system, but I do want to share with you the team of people that I get to work with alongside all of the different departments at McCormick. But this work would be impossible without folks like Grace and Marlon, who are deeply committed to this work. And then I'll just share, we have a website, sbimccormick.org. You can jump on the website and learn more. One of the things that we're working on as part of our public ed and advocacy, it's a podcast series called Abolition as Resurrection. And so it's a mini series. It will launch on Ash Wednesday, and we're going to be in dialogue with some amazing folks who are historians, scholars, directly impacted people, formerly incarcerated folks, and just wrestling with what are the connections between abolition and resurrection. And then if you want to stay connected with us, you can subscribe to our newsletter on our website. And then one other place is that you can jump on our website, and we have a blog. And it's basically our latest news, but we just started this new series. It's called Students Behind Bars, the Voices of Community Healers. And so this is where we will be sharing out the scholarship of the work from the students that we at the Cook County Department of Corrections. And so that concludes my presentation. So thank you.
That was, can everyone hear me? If you're not able to hear me, can you give me a signal? It looks like people are able to hear me okay? Okay, wonderful. That was phenomenal. You may have had a chance, I know those of us who have been listening have been able to see in the chat just some of the accolades, just wonderfully informative, extraordinary information, very well developed model. This has been so illuminative for me personally, and I think that the rest of the viewers feel the same way. So thank you so much for that presentation. We do have some questions, and we have a little bit of time, so I'm going to take a look into the chat and pose some of these questions. You talked about this a little bit, Jia. One of the questions is wondering why the prison system changed so much from rehabilitative to more punitive. You talked a little bit about some of the things in American history. Is there anything else that can help our understanding there from what you already shared with us?
Yeah, so I would definitely say a large part of the reason why that demographic changed was or why the direction changed was because the demographic changed, which is kind of what I alluded in the presentation. But I also want to add to that is that, like, even though the demographic changed, the spirit of punishment was always there. Even though it was the ways in which the rehabilitative aspect of it was directed more towards white folks, it was still it was still this sense of redemptive suffering, this redemptive punishment, right? And I'm gonna say that, like, and I don't want to get too deep into this, but like some of this is around our understanding of atonement theory.
Absolutely.
Right. And so I think that what we recognize is that we live in a culture that really functions off of carceral logic. So we create carceral spaces, right? So, like, I mean, if you just think about how we have replaced guidance counselors with police officers in our school settings, right? We police folks, right? And so we have a culture of punishment that is legitimately embedded in every institution. It's embedded in our interpersonal relationships. And so we have actually never really truly ever functioned as a rehabilitative correctional prison system, or just even in general with people. But we saw but we saw really an abandonment of that when the demographics changed back after chattel slavery. So I hope I answered that question.
Yeah, thank you so much for that and for the additional information. And I think what this leads to, which isn't a conversation that maybe happens in this Zoom, but maybe happens in these classrooms, is how what you are saying sort of pushes at theology and how we really live our lives. I did wrote down the quote, "a spirit of punishment," when you said that, because it really stuck out. Why are we so carcerally minded? As a rhetorical question for us to chew on as we continue to think about all of this. One of the other questions that came up in the chat, you talked about this a little bit towards the end, about balancing investing in the education needed for people in the prison system. How do we do that while advocating for abolition? Like, it seems like a two-pronged, it almost seems like a two-pronged approach. Is that a correct way of framing that?
Yeah, I think it's a really great question. So thank you for that question. I feel like what I'm hearing you say is that like abolition is really kind of moving towards not investing in the system, and so it kind of seems like it's maybe counterintuitive. But Michelle Alexander in Are Prisons Obsolete? She talks about how like one of the challenges of abolitionists is to yes, change and challenge the system and not invest in carceral spaces, while at the same time ensuring that we are taking care of those folks who are currently still incarcerated. And so it's this both and function. And so I think that prisons aren't going to go away tomorrow. Like that's just not going to happen. And so people will continue to be incarcerated. And so how do we as abolitionists make sure that we are still caring for those folks who are incarcerated and helping to kind of mitigate some of those things? And even in some ways, providing them with resources, educational resources, even connectional resources, like becoming a pen pal to someone who's incarcerated, right? There's a lot of benefit to doing this, not because we want to bolster the system, but because there are people that we want to care for, that we want to kind of create these communities of belongings with them and ensure and be a part of their successful release back into community.
Thank you. Here is another question from our viewers. What can or what should education at any level look like in light of the role educational institutions already play in the school to prison pipeline?
I'm thinking. I'm an introvert.
Oh, no, it's fine. Yeah, these are live questions, and no, we're just happy that you are able to spend this time and share this really, really powerful and amazing work. So.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. I think that schools should be places where students can thrive, where students feel seen and heard, and co-participants. I think that it looks like not policing them. It looks like not arresting a 5-year-old, right? Like it looks like finding alternative ways to hold children accountable that aren't reliant on detention and punishment or truancy or expelling them, but a place where we are more thoughtful and asking different questions, not about like what is wrong with you when you act out, but what is going on, right? Like what is leading up to this particular thing? I think that's one thing. I think it's also this is what I love about the abolition movement, is that it's calling for a disinvestment in these carceral spaces and more put into like community-based resources. So I think it's also recognizing that many of our students, many of our young people, especially in Black and Brown communities, are existing in neighborhoods and communities that just lack a lot of some of those fundamental resources. So how do we also pour more resources into our neighborhoods? Recognizing that our students have families and parents, and sometimes they're struggling too, and let's not criminalize parents, right? But how do we also come alongside and support them as well? So I think that I think that because these carceral logics and this punitive way of being, we have a very punitive based educational system. And then I would say the other thing, it's like just thinking about the work we're doing, like teaching people their history, like real history, right? Like this whole fiasco that we have around critical race theory, right? And the ways that it's been confused and co-opted and just turned into something that it's not. Like we're robbing our children, we're robbing our communities. So those are a couple of things. I'm sorry it wasn't as concise, but
I mean, this isn't a simple issue, so it's not going to have simple answers. And one of the things that's been so wonderful about you sharing all of this with us is letting people see the depth and letting people see the complicated personal stories of people that the system has been working to dehumanize, unfortunately. You said,
can I just say something? Something that you just said. I think it's so important because I feel like having the spirit of punishment, this carceral logics, it tries to make things simple. That we can just, it's like this prescription that if we just give you X a number of punishment days, we're going to solve all of our problems. But what you're saying is that, like, no, this is really complex and it's really multi-layered. And so it's going to require that we broaden and expand how it is that we address these issues so that it's intersectional instead of and multi-layered. So thank you for saying that.
You're welcome, and thank you. You had stated the system prepares people to come back to prison. This was sort of in the beginning of your presentation, and I just want to acknowledge the emotion in your voice at the beginning of this presentation as you're telling us how you got into this work. You said that the system prepares people to come back to prison. How do we, as individuals, start to dismantle the system? What individual things can those of us who are listening and concerned, where can we start?
I think that's a great question. And I think for folks that are here, you have started, right? Just being here today is part of starting that. Being here because this topic is important to you. And so you're learning. And so I think part of it is the continued learning journey around these issues. I think the other piece is getting connected and plugged in with a community, a coalition community. I mean, Chicago is just busting at the seams with coalition building and policy work. So folks like Live Free Chicago, doing some really great work around reducing gun violence. The Fully Free campaign has a whole coalition, and you can join in on meetings around that. That's what through Heartland Alliance. Safer Foundation also has a re-entry coalition as well. So I would say finding a community to do this work with is part of that. I think the other thing is that as you are on this learning journey, there's a lot of different policies exist in our institutions, right? So it could be something as simple as asking the question of, like, what does our admissions application say? Does it restrict folks who have the experience of incarceration from being able to access school, degrees here, admissions here? Asking your HR department, who are we permitting to hire? If someone does a background check and they come up with a conviction, will we not hire them? So I think that there's ways that we can begin to have those conversations within our institutional settings. I think also being aware that, like, you probably, just given the statistics, most of us have somebody in our network and our family dynamic who has the experience of incarceration. How are we creating spaces where people feel like they can come out of hiding? So I think it's doing some of that individual work around your own implicit bias when we think about what it means to be incarcerated, and then being intentional around making sure that people feel like, hey, like that experience isn't going to shut you off from being a part of this community of belonging.
Thank you so much for that in-depth answer. What you said about talking to HR, or what you said about the hiring practices, I would just like to mention part of what LSTC did over the past year was begin anti-racism training. There is an anti-racism committee here at LSTC. Part of the work that that committee has done is seeing how white supremacy shows up and manages to keep living in institutions. And so your questions around like, is there a box? Like, do you have to check a box? What happens if someone is at a certain stage? Will they be hired? Like those sorts of questions to me sound like that sort of dismantling of racism institutionally that is so important.
You're spot on. Yes.
Okay, good. I wanted to see if that was a connection and see. We have another question about congregations getting involved in this work. I assume it will be along the same lines as individuals. Find the community that is doing the work. Join your newsletter list, those sorts of things. But again, congregations are also institutions and need to be sort of aware of what they might be perpetuating when they're trying to help and those sorts of things.
Absolutely. And so, you know, this is an area that we will begin to be getting into. I've gotten a couple of calls from congregations who actually, some of them are going to be preparing. They want to be able to be hospitable for someone who's going to be recently released and back into the congregational community. And so we'll be working on kind of putting together some sort of workshop or presentation around that. But what I would definitely say is that like formerly incarcerated people need to be leading this work. Right, being conversation partners with them and inviting them to be a part of the co-creation process of whatever is going to be happening. And so, I mean, it might be something as simple as like a congregation talking to their congregants, right? Around like, hey, this is an area and a direction that we'd really like to go in. And we want to be able to create a space where if we have folks here who are formerly incarcerated, to be able to feel like your voice can be heard and be open to critique, like really open to critique, right? Without a defensive response, but really a posture of listening. And then listening with the intention of wanting to put into practice what it is that they have shared that would make this space a more, a space that is more inclusive. So that would be some of the, I mean, I think at the very bare minimum. And then at some point, like I said, SBI will be able to share some of those resources.
Wonderful. One of the things that you just reminded me of that I wanted to mention quickly, just because I spent a year in Milwaukee, is I spent a year in Milwaukee about a year after the film 53206 came out, which is a film that focuses on that zip code as being one of the ones where the most Black men from have been incarcerated. That film is maybe about 6 years old now. One of the churches I was connected to in Milwaukee, the council president was someone who was formerly incarcerated. Mm-hmm. And it was just it was something I wanted to see more of in churches. So I really appreciate you asking folks to have those conversations. We are getting close to the end of our time, but we do have time for one or two more questions. So if you do have a question for our guest, please go ahead and drop that in the chat. Let's see. The question I have for you now is about making a larger impact, sort of once you have become aware of how huge this problem is. So the reentry ministries, some of them are segregated and disjointed and maybe don't seem to work together. They work independently. What are your tips for organizing to make a larger impact to address some of the issues around mass incarceration?
It's a really great question. I think one of the things that we've kind of talked about in with my team and just some of the folks that I'm with is this piece around like resource sharing. You know, I had someone reach out to us because they're going to start a pen pal program and just wanted some just like feedback. And I was like, oh, sure, let me just give you my resource. You know, we'll just give you some of the resources that we created, like, you know, edit them and kind of make them fit for you. And so I think part of this, part of how we create a bigger, is working collaboratively, as opposed to working in silos that are really silos because we don't want to, because we're competing with each other. Right. I think that happens oftentimes in our social movements and nonprofit spaces, right, where we're all fighting for different dollars or different support, and so it turns into this like this very competitive environment, and oftentimes we lose sight of what we're really trying to do. And so I think having a posture and a spirit of collaboration is one of the ways that we can begin to break down some of those silos. It's simple, but it's very difficult to do in praxis, I feel like, oftentimes, because of this competitive component.
Well, I'm so glad that you said that after reminding us about our sort of carceral frame that we bring to things. And so what I'm being pushed to in listening to this is a really I'm being pushed into sort of a different Christology, like a grace that is not counting, you know, and a grace that is all about sharing. I mean, we're talking about sharing materials. We're talking about not looking at a person's wrongs, but instead looking at their wholeness and what they need to be whole and what their community needs to be whole. This is all so incredibly gospel-centered. And it's just, it sort of sets off connections and ideas, even the history component. I'm someone who loves history, so I'm interested in the stories that we tell ourselves and all of that narrative. There's just been, I think there are lots of ways for the seminary as a whole and for students and congregations to engage this work, and it's so needed. At this time, I'd like to give you the last word. Is there anything you would like to leave us with this evening?
I just want to say thank you. This has been just a really fruitful time. It's been a blessing to me. And I hope that the folks who have been here have been blessed as well. And just want to say thank you for just showing up and being here, and for hosting this space, and for your graciousness and hospitality. So thank you.
Thank you. Just for on behalf of LSTC, on behalf of the committee, on behalf of Marvis, we don't have Marvis. She's on screen right here. I would like to very much thank you for your time, your wisdom, your passion, and your knowledge, and sharing all of this with us, and bringing something that is so needed and so gospel-centered to our attention. So thank you for that. I thank the Black History Committee, all of the planning that has gone into this evening and the past weeks of just wonderful sharing and content. I would like to give them a hand. So if you would like to give the Black History Committee a hand, it is well deserved. Please take that small token as thanks. We have closing worship tomorrow at 11:15. Our Bishop Hill Curry is going to be joining us for worship. You can sign up for that on the LSTC page if you haven't already. And with that, I would like to say thank you and good